Welcome to a very special edition of Figuring Out Fertility, a webinar series by Fertility Matters Canada for Canadian Fertility Awareness Week 2023. I am so glad that all of you are here watching with us and very excited to have our guest, Sara Cohen, with us today. Sara is a fertility lawyer and the past president of Fertility Matters Canada, a longstanding supporter of the work that our organization does. Sara, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, so my pleasure. I'm excited. I'm excited to participate in this week. What a fabulous show we're having. Lots of participation, enthusiasm, encouragement. And I'm so glad that the Canadian community is coming together to really mark how important support is for people participating in fertility treatments of any type.
Amazing. So, Sara, today let's tell our viewers what we're talking about. Sara's specialty is really third-party reproduction, so using a donor or a surrogate in order to help you build your family. So, Sara, why don't you tell everybody just a little bit about what third-party reproduction actually is?
Sure. So, third party reproduction is when there is a person who is helping another person or couple or group of people to conceive or gestate a child who they don't intend to parent. Sometimes I'm involved with things that are a little bit different than that. So things like polyamorous families, etc., or maybe two friends coming together to raise a child together. But something like 99% of what I deal with is a situation where there's either an egg donor, so someone who's donating their eggs to another person or couple in order to help them conceive a child, or a surrogate where the surrogate is carrying a fetus on behalf of another person or couple, etc., who they don't intend to parent. And excitingly, in my opinion, I'm seeing more and more embryo donation, which I think is this wonderful thing. Particularly, I'm really supportive when it's done on a known basis. And this is just, we have so many excess embryos in Canada. And this is an opportunity to not destroy them and to help them for another person or couple who, particularly when they would need donor sperm and donor egg, we already have all these embryos, and donating them to someone else to help them create their family is this wonderful thing. And I'm thrilled we're seeing more and more of it in Canada.
That's amazing. And I am sure in your sort of tenure here in the fertility space, you have seen people who are using surrogacy and donation to build their families growing every year. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, it's when I started about 12 years ago doing this, almost 13 years ago. And there were lots of people, but it's a completely different ballgame right now. So, first of all, I'm thrilled that the stigma involved in third-party reproduction has been lessened to an incredible amount. Some people I find are still a little bit nervous, but for the most part, people are on Instagram, they're sharing their stories, they're on Facebook sharing their stories, they are lobbying the government for changes that are necessary. It's no longer really something that people are quiet about for the most part. And there's lots of people involved in this. I do think that's a really important message for people to hear who are considering third-party reproduction. You're not alone. You will not be the first. You will not be the last. This journey is very well paved at this point in Canada. Totally possible. And I think it's such a wonderful thing that third-party reproduction, it's really more a question of when as opposed to if, because there's just so much available for people that need help conceiving or gestating in certain ways.
Amazing. So if someone is looking, if this has become an option, would they typically find out because they've been through fertility treatment that hasn't been successful? I suppose there are people who would know that they would, if they want to build their family, that they're going to need to use a donor or a surrogate because they don't have all of the pieces, the materials to actually create an embryo, for example. So how does someone figure that out if it's just new to them, or if they already know that this is going to be part of their family building journey? Sort of where do they start?
Okay, so lots of questions there.
Mhm.
Most of my clients start with me and I guide them through. So when I say start with me, if it's a heteronormative, couple, a man and a woman, most often I see them because they've gone to their doctor, they've dealt with fertility treatments, and they're just unsuccessful. To some extent, the hardest ones within that group are the people who just they don't know the reason. And that's really hard because there's not necessarily anything to fix. It seems the egg quality is good. It seems, lining and everything with the uterus looks good. It seems the sperm quality is good. What is going on here? And that is so hard for people. So I do see a lot of heteronormative couples that come to me after really challenging situations. But I also see, kind of like to what you were talking about, a lot of people who do start with me because they know they're going to need third-party reproduction. And perhaps the best example of that is two-dad families. So it's very obvious to them they're going to need an egg donor. It's very obvious to them they're going to need a surrogate. So they don't need to go through the medical process. This isn't about a medical issue, unless, maybe their sperm needs help being extracted, etc. So really, for those people, it's obvious. But there's also single parents, both female and male. And then there's quite a number of women I have worked with who either are born without a uterus or have MRKH, or we've got, unfortunately, there's still people who are on medication that can't gestate a fetus because there's concern about an abnormality within the fetus. And there's people who've gone through cancer treatment, etc., and no longer are able to create sperm or ova that they would need in order to conceive a child.
Amazing to think how much advancement has happened in terms of third-party reproduction, not only in Canada, but across the world, to help families grow is fascinating and very exciting. I would love to connect now because we've got a lot of legislation and some rules in place. And in a lot of our support groups, when people are starting to consider this route, they have questions about what that actually looks like. Can you tell us about some of those, the rules or the laws that exist in Canada, and what people need to know?
Yes. So Canada, in many ways, is extremely successful with third-party reproduction. There are certain laws that I wish were different, but overall, it makes egg donation, sperm donation, embryo donation, and surrogacy legitimate, legal, and available to people. One of the most important things that I'm, as a Canadian, proud of is the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, which is already almost 20 years old, was very clear that someone cannot be discriminated against on the basis of their gender, sex, or marital status. And that's really important. Not everywhere in the world has been as progressive as Canada has been in terms of who can access this. So when we're talking about third-party reproduction, we're talking about federal legislation, which is the same right across Canada. And that legislation talks about things like how old a donor must be. So they must be 18 or older, how old a surrogate must be, 21 or older. One of the things that there's certain contention about and ambivalence about, although I think the general public has really changed their mind on, is that egg donation, sperm donation, embryo donation, and surrogacy cannot be compensated in Canada. And I think there's a lot of pushback with respect to surrogacy and egg donation, some pushback also with respect to sperm donation. There's really no pushback when it comes to embryo donation. So it's not the same thing in terms of what people are worried about. And I think part of the reason is that we've seen, for example, when in 2004, when the Assisted Human Reproduction Act came into force, we had many, many sperm banks across the country. But since that came into force, where we're no longer allowed to pay a donor, $100, $150 for donating their sperm, we've dropped to one national bank. And that one national bank has something like 20 to 40 donors per year, which means we are which means we are using in Canada the same sperm again and again and again. In my opinion, that's far worse than it is to just compensate someone $150 for their sperm. So what we do in Canada is we end up importing something like 95% of our sperm into the country. And it's from places where the donor's compensated anyways, for the most part, right? So in the United States, the donor's compensated. So it's kind of a very silly law. This is compensated donor sperm, but there's a loophole in the law. So we can use that sperm, and then it ends up becoming sperm that's from the United States. We can't have registry because these aren't Canadian. So it ends up, in my opinion, hurting the kids who are conceived through third-party reproduction more than it would be to compensate someone $150. So there's the same or similar arguments with respect to egg donation, and also the same or similar arguments with respect to surrogacy. And surrogates in particular, I find, feel that the law is extremely paternalistic because they are allowed to be reimbursed. And for the most part, surrogates, egg donors, etc., are reimbursed for their expenses incurred as a result. There is a list from Health Canada about categories for which you can reimburse a donor or surrogate, and they are pretty fulsome. So, we don't look in Canada about trying to make sure, they have a bad pregnancy. It's respectful, the categories that are there. That being said, it's so much work for the donors and the surrogates. You must provide receipts for absolutely everything that's reimbursed. And you must swear, basically, a document saying you've only incurred that expense with respect to the surrogacy or the donation as applicable, and only then can you be reimbursed. So for many reasons, there are problems with federal legislation. And then something else that's really important to know is the question of who is a parent through third-party reproduction changes province by province. So there are some provinces like Ontario, British Columbia, who've really changed their legislation, include actually Manitoba, Saskatchewan, PEI. More and more provinces have actually recognized that it's not just one or two people being born through third-party reproduction, but many. So they've actually taken the time to look at this and recognize that a donor is not a parent, that the intended parents are the parent, how we deal with surrogacy, etc. And for the most part, I don't love all the legislation. There might be pieces that I don't like, but for the most part, it's great legislation. And then there's still some provinces that are lagging behind in terms of recognizing who is a parent or being not as progressive. So, for example, Alberta requires, if you're using a surrogate, there still must be one genetic connection related to the embryo in order to make the parents the legal parents of the child, where there's places like Ontario or British Columbia where the entire idea is about the intention, who intended to be a parent, not genetic connection, not gestation, but really who intended to be a parent and who intended not to be a parent. And we're going to recognize that and honor that. So that's pretty much what's going on in Canada. The parentage is really dynamic right now. So there's some provinces, for example, New Brunswick, there's a new case this week that was really helpful in recognizing who is a parent in third-party reproduction. So please, if you are dealing with third-party reproduction, you must speak to a lawyer very early on in the process so you don't make a mistake in terms of who is a parent, and so you don't accidentally break the law. When you break the federal law, it's potentially punishable by up to 10 years in jail and or $500,000, which is wild. And most of the fertility lawyers in Canada, including myself, give free consultations. So please take advantage of that. Talk to someone, make sure you understand, have all the pieces, kind of the framework set up, so that you don't accidentally break the law or put yourself in a situation that's not safe for parentage and have to go backwards.
That's amazing advice. So much to consider, and that's incredibly important for people to know. Anytime someone comes to our organization looking for first steps, we always send them a list of fertility lawyers in Canada so that they can start those conversations to make sure that they aren't making a misstep right out of the gate. Such a big decision. And, at the end of the day, you're also thinking, yes, right in the moment, hopefully having the opportunity to take home a baby. But then the the donor conceived child or the child born as a result of this third party reproduction, they're going to grow up to be a person. And we really need to consider their rights and their life and what they're going to want for their future.
I totally agree. And that's why I'm so passionate that provinces need to create a registry. So that information about who the donor is, and who the donor conceived people are genetically related to really ought to be kept for them. And that ought to be available to them. So I engage almost primarily in known donation, and either my clients are already on board, or to be honest, I gently encourage them and explain how important it is for the donor conceived person to one day be able to access the information about who the donor is. And because we don't have any provincial registries right now, you can't really count on an agency or a clinic to share that information with you. What if that agency doesn't exist 19 years from today and the clinic has no obligation to share that information with you? So I think the intended parents need to hold on to that information, and the donor needs that information from the get-go. So I highly recommend that. And I hope we can have a different discussion when the provinces actually start creating registries for donor conceived people in particular. And I don't believe they're going to do that until the federal legislation changes and we stop relying on like 95% of our donor sperm coming from outside Canada, where they couldn't really create a registry anyways because we don't have access to that information.
Yeah, that makes, when you think about it, I understand when the laws went into place, they were trying to protect. They had the intention was good, but here we are 20 years later and we know what's happening. We know who the surrogates are for the most part. We know the general sort of makeup of a surrogate in Canada or a donor in Canada. And of course, we want healthy outcomes. So people are making decisions not based on what we figured 20 years ago. So it's good to have these conversations so that people understand A, why they exist, and B, where actually changes could be made, continued to be made to have better outcomes for everybody involved.
Yes, I agree. And I also, although I'm not a counselor or psychologist, I really recognize the importance of their role in helping to do psychological assessments or even just psychoeducational to explain to intended parents and to donors why secrecy is really to be avoided.
Mhm.
I've found that 20 years ago, etc., there was an encouragement towards secrecy, and there's still a few doctors that seem to really encourage towards secrecy, but the counselors don't seem to, the lawyers don't seem to. And I think that's important, maybe because we're not just involved at the front end, but we're also involved at the back end, where there's a child who comes into the world and we have to worry about what's best for them too.
Agreed. And we do live in a time where things like ancestry.ca and 23andMe exist. And when these children are born, they have the option and autonomy to do those types of tests. I mean, I certainly have done them, and I know where my genetics came from. And I did it because I was interested to learn about our family history. And so I can imagine that could be very traumatizing for someone, as an adult that didn't receive that information and sort of their entire birth and conception story, and make that wasn't a normal part of who they were as they grew up.
Exactly. So I'm lucky enough to coordinate every other year the fertility law conference, the only national fertility law conference. And this last year I had arranged, and we really enjoyed a talk by a man who was donor conceived. His issue was he had never been told he was donor conceived. So he found out this information, and it wasn't the fact that he was donor conceived that was upsetting to him. It was the fact that the secret had been kept from him for so long, and that really causes problems for people. So do consider that, do talk to a counselor who's involved in the fertility world, not just your regular counselor, and think about that. I don't think you can even hope that this child will not find out one day for the exact reasons that Carolyn mentioned. So 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and I think it's just going to get bigger and bigger.
Yeah, definitely, especially with AI and all kinds of new things that are happening. There's, who knows where we're going to be in another even 10 years.
Agreed.
Okay, so let's connect a little bit on embryo donation. So I feel that it's a more challenging space to get information about. Patients come to us, and when I started in this role 8 years ago, we still have a lot of people that come to us figuring out, like, how do I get a surrogate? I'm in Atlantic, Canada, and I'm not exactly sure what to do, for example. But I feel that embryo donation, so people curious how they donate embryos, and then on the other side, people looking to adopt embryos and what that process looks like in Canada.
Yeah. So first of all, in terms of dealing with people who are in Atlantic Canada and don't know how to access a surrogate, like for example, someone like me works right across the country in that. So don't worry. The fact that you are in Nova Scotia doesn't mean that you can't deal electronically with someone like me in Toronto. So the information is available there. You just have to find your way to the information. That's a challenge. In terms of embryo donation, I find that more and more clinics are open to doing this. And thank goodness, because a big blockage in the ability to do this was that for whatever reason, certain clinics were just not comfortable with it. I think one has to think about this carefully. There are certain clinics that you just check off, you want to donate your embryos, and you'll never know where they go. That's not for me, but it could be for other people. That's not really so much what I'm talking about in terms of what embryo donation. And by the way, we don't call it embryo adoption because you're not adopting the child. As soon as these are donated to you, the embryos are yours, the child is yours. There's no question. So it's not a change of legal status for the child. It's just a change of legal status for the donated embryos. Sorry, back to the point here. So that is not, for me, the best way to do this. For the reasons we just talked about with sperm donation and egg donation, what I really like to see happen is people who have excess embryos put themselves out there, and people who need embryos put themselves out there. So there is an organization called Beginnings that I really appreciate. They do great work. What they've done is take the information and the lessons they learned in another context, such as adoption, and apply the ideas of best interests of the child to embryo donation, and they help people meet each other and coordinate. So that's one way. I actually see a lot of people doing this over Facebook groups. I know that sounds wild, but it's true, and it happens all the time. I'm working on a bunch of them now. Some people do it between family members or friends they know. I truly think this is a wonderful thing to be done known. I think some people do it for religious reasons because they don't believe in the destruction of embryos. Some people do it because they are paying hundreds of dollars every single year to cryopreserve embryos that they're never going to use. And some people do it just out of generosity and the idea that it took a lot for them to create these embryos. And there's other people, like, why should they also have to, whether it's spend that money or go through the emotional part and the physical risk, etc., when they already have embryos? So I think it's great. What I really like to see personally is when these people come together and say, let's figure out how to do this. There's no money being exchanged. There are legal fees being exchanged typically, and there are psychological counseling being required by the clinic, usually the same way they would for egg donation or sperm donation or surrogacy. And then we figure out what information we are going to be legally obligated to exchange with each other. So for example, if the donors find out new medical information about themselves or their children, and that could affect the health of the donor conceived person, are they obligated to share that information? Are the intended parents, who are the recipients of the donor embryos, are they required to advise the donors each time a child is born. Do we want to share names, birth dates, etc.? Honestly, we also want to be aware we don't want the kids having sex with each other. So I know that sounds wild, but we've seen stranger things happen. So I have a lot of people in Ontario, for example, in particular southwestern Ontario for some reason, who end up donating their embryos, and the people they're donating to aren't so far away from them. We want these kids, or in my opinion, I think we want these kids to know who their donor siblings are. You don't have to be best friends. You don't have to see each other every year. You don't have to see each other ever if that's what you want. But at least let them know they exist so that they don't end up in relationships with each other or sexual relationships with each other, etc. So those are the kind of things we exchange, a medical exchange of information, the fact that donor conceived people exist. What if there's more kids that are conceived by the intended parents? What if they only donate some of the embryos to these intended parents? What happens to the other one? And just making those connections. We don't usually make an agreement of how many times a year we're going to be in touch, etc., etc. That's usually not what we do, but we also do deal with some more technical things like confidentiality. Who are you allowed to tell? Are you allowed to tag people on Facebook? Again, I know that sounds crazy, but in this day and age, we want to worry about that.
Yeah, those are incredible considerations. And for people who are in this journey, if they're on this path, these things are, they've probably already had these conversations with their lawyers or with their spouse or partner, some of their families maybe. But for the general people, like the general public watching this, such important information and really good to consider that donor conceived children using third party reproduction, whether that's a donor or a surrogate, like this is a beautiful way to build families and to be open and accepting. And I mean, I don't know how often, like we talked about at the top of the hour, it is more, I don't want to say mainstream, but it's out there now. It's people are talking about it. People are very public about their journeys. But I have heard, and we still hear about people that are a bit standoffish or unsure because most likely they don't have all the information, and they have an old way of thinking about what this actually is.
Right. And I think to some extent that's where Fertility Matters Canada really plays an important role, because offering support to people to find, their community involved in this is so important. You aren't alone. There are a lot of people. I've personally worked with thousands of Canadians or other parties involved in third party reproduction in Canada at this point over the last 12 years. You're definitely not alone. I know I'm fortunate enough to have children, and in their classrooms, there are children born or conceived through third party reproduction. And, that's not rare at this point. And just because you don't think you know anyone who's done this, you really well might, and they just didn't tell you. So find your people, talk to your people. If you can, talk to people who've been through it and already are out the other side and can share their story with you. Facebook groups is a wonderful way to do it, or talk to Carolyn or anyone else at Fertility Matters Canada, and you can find your people and learn just how supported you can be, and how you aren't alone, and you're not the first, and there are many people who are in the same situation as you.
Definitely. And if you're watching this and this is part of your story, you have been a surrogate, you've used a surrogate, you've used a donor, you are a donor conceived child, and you want to share your story and your journey, we encourage you, if you're in a place to do that, please, you sharing those stories really helps people who aren't able to be as out there, or aren't in a place yet in their lives where they're uh, comfortable getting vulnerable. It's such a vulnerable place to be. So sharing, and we would love to share through Fertility Matters, whether on this Figuring Out Fertility web series, or on our podcast, or on some of our social media channels. We would love to connect with you to share your stories so that more and more people feel normalized in the decisions that they're making.
I do want to say one thing that I didn't address is that I have never worked with an individual or a family whose child is donor conceived who has come back and said to me, I don't feel like this is my child. So I want you to know that. I definitely have heard people at the beginning and say, will I connect? Will I feel differently? And in my experience, the answer is you will feel that they are your child, no questions asked, and they will be. Canadian law is so strong in most provinces that legally, socially, and emotionally, this is your child.
Yeah, so beautiful. Thank you. That's a good reminder. And that's why it's important to connect with a reproductive counselor through this process to help you walk through and give you the tools to, because I'm sure there is a roller coaster of emotions that comes along with this, this path to parenthood, and the support is there. So please utilize it. It will make your journey that much easier. So Sara, before we wrap up, what are the sort of top 3 takeaways for viewers?
So the top 3 is probably start with a lawyer. You're going to be able to access a free consultation. Do it so you don't have to make mistakes. The second thing is this is possible. Whatever you're hoping to do, it might not be in the exact way you think you're going to do it, but it is very possible to be able to conceive a child through third-party reproduction in Canada. We're very fortunate. And I would say the third part is that you need to think about is just make a great team. Good doctor that you trust, good lawyer you trust, and a counselor you feel good with.
Amazing. Thank you for that. For all of our viewers, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Figuring Out Fertility. Don't forget, Fertility Matters Canada has a new podcast called Fertility in Focus. So go catch that on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Don't download, like, subscribe, do all of those podcast things. This is Canadian Fertility Awareness Week, where we are bringing you education, information, and continuing to advocate for better access to care for Canadians who need reproductive technologies to help them build their families. Thanks for being here.